Okay, so next we're looking at a task 1 essay. We're analysing 2 pie charts. So we're looking at energy use in an Australian household and comparing that to the greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously with a task 1, you need to be picking out the main features. You want to sort of paraphrase what the topic of the pie charts are. You want to give an overview summary of the sort of main comparison between them that you're going to make. And throughout the essay, you should be thinking, where are you going to compare the 2 pieces of information? How are you going to organize your essay? So ideally, you should be able to find 2 points of comparison and an overall trend to talk about. So when I'm looking at these 2 pie charts, I'm thinking, okay, well, it doesn't give any dates, so everything should be in the present tense, pretty much. So we don't know when. So there's no, like, so make sure you check if there's any dates on it. The first thing I'm looking at is I'm thinking, okay, well, there's this huge chunk water heating at 30% in this graph, and then at 32% over here. So almost staying almost the same, 30% to 32% is a large chunk. That's probably a good trend to talk about. The other thing I see when I straight away look at it is heating is 42% over here, but yet only 15% of greenhouse gases, okay? So I'm thinking, okay, so heating is the biggest user of energy in Australia, but yet one of the smallest sources of greenhouse gas. And I'm like, okay, while over here we've got other appliances, which are 15% of energy use, but account for 28% of greenhouse gases. Okay, so we're sort of looking at that. So I can already see, okay, we've got some comparison that the things that use the most energy don't necessarily produce the most greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so there's not a one-to-one relationship between it. Okay, so that would be my first thought of comparison. The thing we should be comparing is, what are they spending money, what is using the most energy, and is it producing the most greenhouse gas emissions? So for example, we've got refrigeration, only uses 7% of energy, but produces 14% of greenhouse gas emissions. So one thing I would do is if I was this candidate, I'd probably be comparing in that sense. And then I would probably be sort of go through before I started writing and rank them in a list, like from biggest here at 32% down to smallest here at 3%. And then have a look and then see if that ranking of this one from biggest to sort of smallest is the same as the ranking over here. Okay, and I would possibly make a comparison on that line as well. So let's have a look and see what this candidate has done. So the former pie chart indicates the amount of energy consumption in Australian households. The latter pie chart indicates the gas emissions of the Australian greenhouse. Okay, so the former pie chart indicates the amount of energy consumption in Australian households. It illustrates the gas emissions of the Australian greenhouse. Okay, so I can see what this candidate is trying to do is they're trying to use a bit more sophisticated grammar by using former and latter. The issue here is that if you're going to say the former and the latter, it's referring to something you've previously said. So you can't say it in the first sentence. You need to have a sentence referring to the pie chart. So you need to say the 2 pie charts say you can't really use former and latter here in this situation. So if I was going to give an example of how to use former and latter, it's a way of referring to 2 things you said in a previous sentence. For example, if I said, I have read both Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, the former in high school and the latter at university. So then you know from reading that I read Harry Potter in high school and I read Lord of the Rings in university. Okay? But I need to have that first sentence where I set up the 2 pie charts, so I set up the 2 subjects. This candidate, you can't do that when referring to a picture like this. Okay? So you could say the 2 pie charts indicate the first pie chart indicates the amount of energy consumption in Australian households, and the second pie chart illustrates the gas emissions of the Australian greenhouse. The former indicates that energy consumption in Australia was increasing, and the latter illustrates that the greenhouse gas emissions were falling. You would have to have some way of doing it like that, but the way this candidate has done it is incorrect and doesn't really make sense. I can see what they've tried to do, but they've not used the grammar correctly. Okay, so let's have a look, and this should be the overview. It is clearly seen that the highest proportion of heating, the highest proportion of energy use is heating in the first chart. On the other hand, cooling is the least figure in the same chart, is the smallest figure. Also in the greenhouse, water heating makes up the largest part, and the cooling part is the smallest figure in the former chart. Okay, so this is not a good overview. Okay, why is this not a good overview? It's too specific. This candidate isn't comparing. They're not giving a trend. They're just dryly telling me information. The highest proportion is heating in the first chart. Cooling is the smallest. On the other chart, water heating is the largest. Cooling is the smallest figure. They've tried to do a little bit like the former chart, but it's not very good or clear comparison. A good overview, you should be giving me a general sense about the overall trends of the information. Okay, so if I was going to give an overview for these charts, and this is actually one of the more challenging things to give an overview of, because it's just a static comparison, there's no change over time. But I would give an overview that was something like, it is clear that there are some surprising comparisons between the two charts, namely that the areas that consume the most energy do not necessarily produce the largest amounts of greenhouse gas. Okay, so that we're talking about the overall trend. The things that we spend the most energy on, e.g. heating, do not necessarily produce the most greenhouse gas. So that's the main trend, or the main piece of information you can interpret from this graph, okay? What this candidate has done is they've said, this is the biggest, this is the smallest, this is the biggest, this is the smallest. But they've not told me what does that mean, okay? So an overview is not just giving the data straight up. It's trying to come to some kind of analysis, or what does that data tell us, okay? So that's what you need to be having in your overview. So this is not a good overview because it's just telling me two basic things, and they're trying to do a little bit of comparison. So let's have a look at the detail paragraphs. In detail, the biggest part of house energy consumption is heating, up to 40%, followed by water heating to 30%. Moreover, the heating figure and water heating occupy more than 60%. Also, the remaining four categories, refrigeration, other appliances, lighting and cooling, take up 7%, 15%, 4%, and 2% respectively. Okay, so this is quite a good way of conveying a lot of information. I like the word respectively. I like the way this candidate has said appliances, lighting, cooling, 17%, 40%. Oh yeah, refrigeration. So I like the way that they've given that information. That's a good sentence to use. But my issue is that there's no comparison between this information and the other information. So what this candidate has done is they've just repeated the information that's on the pie chart. They've just taken all the words, appliances, and the data, and they've just reset it to me in another sentence, okay? So, I mean, it's fine, but it's not what you need to be trying to do in a task 1 essay like this, okay? What I recommend is is to find two things that you're going to compare the charts on. Have paragraph 1, comparison 1, paragraph 2, comparison 2. Okay, so what they could be doing here is, again, like we just talked about, comparing the fact that while we have a large amount of, heating, energy expenditure, that this is actually smaller over here. And that's the same for the opposite for refrigeration. We spend less on it, but it has actually got more greenhouse gas. Okay, so that's a comparison that you can make in one comparison. Okay, and then you could maybe you could then compare the ones that are quite similar. So you could say cooling remains the smallest in both the graphs. Water heating remains about equal in both graphs. Okay, so that would be another comparison. Let's look at the second paragraph. Turning to the next pie chart, the percentage of water heating is 32%. That is the highest figure. It is followed by other appliances to 28%. plus the water heating part, and the other appliances stand at 50%. Lastly, the remaining 4 categories: refrigerating, heating, cooling, lighting, okay. They basically almost copied and pasted the 2 paragraphs, and they're just giving me, again, they're just giving me the detail. Okay, what the task wants you to do is it wants you to try and compare between the 2 graphs. And to be fair to this candidate, the graphs they've been given are quite difficult because it's just static information. Okay, what would have been much easier to do is if there'd been 4 pie charts. Maybe we had an Australian household compared to a French household, or something like that would have made this easier for the candidate. But what they've done, which is what you should never do, is that you should just talk about pie chart 1 and then talk about pie chart 2 separately. Okay? You're going to get much more sophisticated grammar, much more sophisticated vocabulary by doing comparisons within the paragraph. Okay? So at the very least, what this candidate should have done is combined these 2 paragraphs into one and done comparisons as they were going through. Okay? Rather than just in a very dry, kind of boring, simple way, just repeated the figures and the information that's on the charts. Okay? So I'm a sort of, it's hard to judge because I'm like, well, you know, the sentences are sort of okay, but what the information they're giving me is not great. You know, punctuation should probably be a colon. That is the highest figure. The water heating, proportion, probably be proportion here. But I think while this was a challenging graph to talk about, I think this candidate hasn't really tackled it in the correct way. And if I was them, it's easy, I think, for a lot of candidates to write off task 1 because people think it's just easy. It's just describing the information. So I think either candidates do a thing where they spend all their time preparing for task 2 and ignore the sort of how to structure a good task 1 essay, or they spend all their time focusing on line graphs and they ignore the processes, they ignore the maps, and they ignore the charts like this. So when it comes up in the exam, they don't have the practice to know how to structure it. Task 1, it's really quite specific what they want you to do in the exam in terms of an overview and a paraphrase and then talking about detail. So the real key thing to prepare for task 1 is going through lots of examples and picking out comparison points between the data you've been given and what overall trend can you pick up. That's what you need to practice, because once you're quick at doing that and thinking where you can compare the information, it's going to be much easier to write a higher scoring task 1 essay. Because I think a lot of candidates think that you literally just need to repeat the data, and that's not what they're looking for the task, okay, to get those higher bound scores. So if we're looking at task achievement, I would, be giving a 5. So I was like, okay, they did, describe the data and stuff, okay, that's fine. For coherence and cohesion, they did use, by the way, I'm skipping that because that was just a repeat of one of the other paragraphs. They did turn to the next paragraph in detail, plus they use, respectively. So I'm like, okay, coherence and cohesion, probably a 5. The vocabulary, probably a 4.5. They didn't paraphrase that much. They repeated a lot of the vocabulary. And the grammar, probably a 5 as well. Because they did repeat the same sentence structures a lot. They did try and use some more complex sentences, but it was sort of quite repetitive. So I would give an overall 5 for this task 1. And I would really go through this candidate again. How do you structure a task 1? And how do you write a task 1 answer that is not just repeating the information? Obviously, in the detailed paragraphs, you do have to talk about the specific figures that they give you, but it should not just be a dry listing of the data in the task 1. So that's what I would do with this candidate. I would go through them and I would discuss more how to compare, how to find interesting things to say about information that doesn't look that interesting. Okay, so that's what I would do. This is quite a challenging task 1 to do, but what I would want to do is I would want to discuss how you can tackle even a more difficult task 1 like this.